All right. How are we doing? Good. So, hey, my name is Jeff Strauss. I am from St. Louis, Missouri, which is like in the middle of the United States, about as far away from here as you can possibly be. I am a software engineer, architect, do a lot of things with the web, work for a company called Worldwide Technology. But in addition to all those other things, I am also a lawyer. I'm sorry. Been licensed, I'm still licensed, even though I don't practice law. I've been licensed for about 15 years, even though I haven't actually practiced for about 10. Importantly, this is really important, hear me out. I'm not your lawyer. Cool, not your lawyer. Very important for a couple of reasons. One, I don't want to be disbarred. But also, we're going to be talking about sort of licensing issues and legal type topics, sort of the ins and outs of the different open source licenses that are available today that people use in projects. And I know a lot of times people come with specific questions, and that's cool. Ask questions, throw your hand up, throw something at me, whatever, we'll talk. Just realize that the thing about attorneys is that like, if you have a lawyer, you shouldn't hate them. In fact, you should love your lawyer. But your lawyer knows your situation, knows your ins and outs and things like that, and I'm like just a dude on a stage from Missouri. Right? So just remember, hashtag not your lawyer. Cool. All right, so as I said, we're going to talk about open source, and open source software, open source licenses, kind of the implications, especially in enterprise settings, what happens when we use open source software, like why does this matter? Is anyone here like actually feel like they rarely or never use open source in their daily jobs? Like, is that possible? Like, can you write software today without open source? I guess you could. Doesn't seem like a very good idea, right? And these days it is basically impossible, right? There's so many frameworks, so many reasons that we want to kind of incorporate what other people have done, build on top of things like that. It's everywhere, right? I'm a .NET guy by, you know, for the most part, most of my work is .NET, and everything that isn't is JavaScript, and like everything's open source. Right? But we have to think about these things. We have to think about sort of how we use it and what it means and why we use what we use. Now, first, I want to talk about sort of some definitions because I want to level set. I want to kind of get us all on the same page. A lot of people use this term, open source software, OSS. But like, we keep using that term? Like, what does that really mean? What's it mean to be open source software? I think a lot of people, we use it every day, but do we really take the time to think about what it actually is? Someone tell me what you think open source is. Like, anyone, throw a hand up. What does it mean to be open source? Someone's going to throw a hand up because otherwise I'm going to point. Yeah.
You're out in public. You're showing everybody code.
You're showing everybody your code. Yeah? Dylan? Someone? You're accepting contributions. Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's interesting, the public domain. So that's interesting. Well, no, I understand. Lost my mic. So public domain is interesting. Now, I will say, terms mean different things in different places, right? I'm not an Australian attorney by any stretch. Public domain is actually something that's interesting because it's different, right? Like in the United States, if something's in the public domain, it's not OSS. It's public domain works. Like the idea about open source, and that kind of actually, I'm glad you said that, taking kind of a step back, open source software really has a very specific meaning. Like the things you're saying are all true, like you can see the source code, you can share it, you get this information, but really open source software is software specifically that is available and distributed under an open source license. And what an open source license means is that it's one of a handful of recognized available licenses that satisfy a set of criteria. As opposed to something like public domain, which is sort of dedicated out to the public domain and is, in a lot of respects, public domain generally suggests, like, I've given up all rights. Like, all rights to the thing that I've created are just out there for anybody. When you have open source software, someone, an author, authors, contributors, all still actually have maintained and retained their rights and their ownership and their copyright, but they're just licensing it to you for use under some certain terms and conditions. And we're going to talk through what all these mean. First off, free redistribution. Right? Free. One of the first things people often say when I say, what is open source? People say it's free software. Well, that's true. That's true. People get excited about the idea of free. We get excited because I got to solve a problem at work. It was due like 3 days ago. I got to figure out what to do, and I found this thing, and it's free, and it's right here. But I think a lot of times when people think about open source software being free software, they think free, like we hear the word free, and it means something different than what we really mean, right? When we talk about free software, we mean free as in free speech, not free as in free beer. Right? It may be free as in free beer. It might be. It doesn't have to be. We mean freedom of information. And the reason for that is because open source as a thing kind of predates, or free software, I should say, predates open source as like a formalized thing. Right? Open source software, and the idea, and we'll talk about more about kind of the different licenses and the open source definition, but open source is a thing really only goes back, 20, 25 years. It hasn't been around that long, but freeware, free software has been around longer than that. And the idea of freedom here, when we talk about freedom of information, it comes out of people like Richard Stallman and other people in the free software community who believe that when you have software that's executing in your environment, on your machine, you should have access to the information to understand what is executing in your environment. If you receive software and it's running on your server, on your box, you should know what it's doing. So it's about that freedom of information, about sharing and knowing what it is that you're putting on your machine. Maybe free as in free beer, it doesn't have to be. Okay? So source code seems like kind of the other thing everyone thinks of, like, oh, you get to see the source code. True. And specifically, you get to see the source code in its entirety. It needs to be readily available. Doesn't always have to be shipped with the software. Like, there's kind of a time, remember, like, those of us who are old enough remember that software actually used to be shipped, like, on physical stuff that had the software on it. And usually open source that came, like on a disk or in a box of like 40 little 3.5-inch floppy disks, whatever, that often had the source code included and distributed with the package. With most things being digital today, it doesn't actually have to be with the distribution, but it needs to be very clear how to get it, and it has to be readily available at no charge or nominal charge, but really it needs to be freely available. And it has to be the source code. Right? I think most people understand that doesn't mean binaries, like this is not source code, that doesn't count, but also neither is that. Okay? That's not source. It's something. It doesn't count. So in a world where everything is JavaScript, and like everything, so many open source JavaScript libraries, the actual, even if you have tools that could take this and turn it back into source, that's not good enough. It can't be incumbent upon the consumer to figure out how to decompile or deobfuscate. No, the original source in its original format has to be readily available. Okay? Derived works. This is interesting. This is a little different. Related to the free redistribution, but not quite the same. Derived works is really two different rights that are closely related. For one, you have the right to modify it. So I build an open source library. I put it out there somewhere under some open source license. You receive it. Not only are you allowed to take that, use it, and redistribute the same thing that you've received from me, you have the right to screw around with it. You have the right to make changes, improve it, add features, fork it, right, and do whatever, and play around with it. And not only do you have the right to modify it, but then you have the right to redistribute the modified work that you've created, right? Redistribution not only of the original work, but of your derived work that came out of the thing that you received. Now this is important because when we think about distribution, and we talk a little bit about the different licenses, the MITs and the Apaches and the GPLs of the world. Yes, they're licenses. Yes, I'm saying, here you go, have my software, and you can do things with it, but there are restrictions because it's not public domain. Right? You're getting software under certain rights and conditions and stipulations, so sometimes, especially with things like GPL, you can redistribute, but. And certain conditions apply. And those conditions trigger when you've distributed, which raises the question, what is distribution in the first place? When have I redistributed software? What does that mean? Because most of the terms of the licenses have nothing to do with me. If I just download someone else's package and I put it on my machine and I play around with it and it never goes anywhere else, most of the restrictions and limitations of the license don't apply. Because I haven't actually tried to reshare it with anybody else. I'm strictly a consumer. I'm no longer a downstream producer. I'm only consuming. So when have you distributed? And it's kind of an interesting thing, and it can get hairy. For one thing, let's say you have like a global organization, So imagine you work for Acme Corp. And with Acme Corp, you have an Acme Corp owned machine. And they provided it to you. And you're building stuff. And you build some tools. And maybe you use some open source. And it's like an internal tool that everyone in the company uses. The thing is, you haven't distributed anything. Because it's all kind of within the four walls. And not necessarily physically, but virtual walls is fine. Within the four walls of the company. And really, all those machines, all that hardware, are owned, presumably, by the company, if you're an employee. What if you're a contractor? What if you have outside vendors? What if you have tools that are really only used for you and your business, your line of business, but you have other people you do business with, and the thing gets distributed to their machines, and now you've distributed software. Take it a step further, what about software as a service? Because remember, like the floppy disks and the CD-ROMs and DVDs, we don't really do that anymore. And not only that, but more and more, we aren't really building thick clients, right? We're building not websites, but services in the cloud, APIs. Are we distributing something? The thing about lawyers, one of the things we say most often is maybe, or it depends, or it's kind of like a lawyerly thing to say. And so the answer is it kind of depends. It depends upon the license and exactly what you're doing. So assume you've got a service up in the cloud, right? But someone's sitting here consuming your service. So you serve up a site. The website is ending up on this guy's laptop or whatever. The executing code for the API is not. And remember, where did the freedom of information come from? The Richard Stallman ideas, right? Which is you've got something executing in a certain environment, so you have the right to know what's happening there. Most licenses say that the API itself that's sitting up on some cloud server somewhere, that's not being distributed. But anything that's being shipped down to the client machine, like your JavaScript, your HTML, your CSS, anything else that's being passed down to the client is. Same thing with like mobile devices, right? You got to think about where is the software executing, where does it live? Now, even then, there's still kind of gotchas, and we'll talk about that some more in a bit too. But most of the time, the answer is, where's the thing running? And if it's running up in the cloud, you haven't distributed it, but the pieces that you're shipping out, you have, and you have to think about that. Two other pieces. Non-interference. Non-interference is kind of a weird one. I always struggle with how to illustrate and describe this, but the idea here is that you have to maintain neutrality. Neutrality in distribution, neutrality in environment, neutrality, say, in operating system. So I develop a piece of software, and I built it to run in a Linux environment. The terms of the license cannot prevent you from using it in another environment. I can't restrict the way that distribution happens. So you can't sort of block it and say, you can only use this in a Linux environment. Now, it may be built to run on Linux, but if you're able to take it and modify it, make a derived work that will run in Windows or run somewhere else, that's OK, and you can't restrict that. You can't restrict what it gets distributed with. You can't say, well, you can have this software, but it must always be packaged with this other thing. Or it can never be packaged with this other thing. You can't, right, nothing outside sort of the confines of that piece of software can have anything to do with what you are allowed to do or not do with the piece of open source. Does that make sense? Or another way to think about it, and in a related note, it's not even enough. So we'll talk about this, but who's already familiar with GPL? Copyleft ideas, people. So if you've dealt with GPL, there's this idea of, well, once open, always open. But even then, the piece of open source software may always be open, but you can't require that it, say, only work in an environment that also only has an open source kernel and other open source software, things like that. You cannot stop somebody from having it distributed and running alongside other proprietary software, as long as it's separate packages and separate software. Okay. And lastly, non-discrimination. Discrimination is kind of like it feels like a trigger word, but we don't necessarily mean discrimination the way we usually think about it. We mean discrimination of purpose, discrimination of use. Suppose now instead I'm Acme Bank Corp. And I've built a big financial engine. And there's a piece of that my company, my bank, wants to open source. I cannot restrict a user of that open source software. I can't say anyone can use this thing as long as you don't use it in financial software or commercial financial software. Because you can all use it, but you can't use it to compete back with me. That's discrimination. If you want to use it and discriminate with someone else, I can't stop you. There was actually a whole thing with Crockford. Crockford had this deal where he built some stuff and actually finally decided, forget it, then I'm not doing open source on a library once, because he actually specifically wanted to make his own license and say it can be used for any purpose but not for evil. And the open source initiative came back and said, that's discriminatory. Like, seriously, he said, well, screw that. And he kept the clause in, but the idea is that you can't even discriminate for evil purpose or evil use. So if Voldemort wants to go and build something because he's tired of relying on like human error and Death Eaters and stuff and wants to build something open source to go and like slaughter mudbloods, right? Nothing in the license can prevent that from happening. Now, doesn't mean he's not going to Azkaban. Okay? Doesn't mean that he's free from consequence. Just means that the license terms can't prevent him from doing that evil thing. Because we're talking here about contracts and intellectual property law. A license is still a legal document. So when I build something, I put it out there and put it under MIT, that MIT is a contract, right? It's a legally binding thing that gives terms and conditions under which you can use my copyrighted material, or in some cases my patented or patentable material. Has nothing to do with criminal law or any other kind of law. So the consequences may still be there. It's just separate from the question of whether something's open source and what that means. And intellectual property law generally really comprises a few different things. And it's important to also distinguish there. So I build something, and I create a work. Right? Software is really a work of authorship. That software has, as the author, I hold copyright over that. I may also have things that are patentable that are in that software. I may also apply my personal brand or my company brand to that, which is like a trademark, my identity and associate there. Those are three different types and three different pieces of intellectual property. For the most part, when we talk about open source software, we're talking about copyright law, most of the time. We're saying my copyright interest in this, I've retained it, but I'm allowing you to have a non-exclusive license to use my copyrighted thing. Some licenses, as we'll see, also deal with patent. Not all. And they don't deal with trademark. Trademark's identity. So even if you receive software and you're going to use it, don't assume someone else's identity. Don't pretend that you are that original organization. That should go without saying, but shockingly frequently it seems not to. So you can't assume another organization or author's identity and treat it as if it's your own. No one's licensing you their trademarks or their personal brand. They're only licensing you their copyright and maybe their patents. What about sale? Can you sell open source? Yeah, absolutely you can. I mean, you can make a lot of money. You can make a lot of money with open source software. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Because free information, not free beer. Free speech, not free beer. So you can sell it. The question is how? Because here's the thing. I create open source. I put it out there. I want to sell it. You buy it. You turn around, and the next day, you sell it for 50 cents less to everybody else. I can't stop you from doing that. I mean, it's open source, and you can freely redistribute my work. So why would anyone pay my price? And if you're just going to undercut me, in which case, how am I even going to sell it in the first place? How do we do that? Ideas? Support? Yeah? Software as a service. Think about kind of the distinction, like the distinction here, right? In my mind, I kind of consider these two different terms, right? And it's easy to conflate them, but they're not. Commercializing software is like, I've sold it and I've made money from it. Proprietary is like not open. But look at like Red Hat. Think about the Linux kernel. Red Hat Enterprise Linux and all the tooling that sits on top of it, a lot of that stuff, notably the kernel, but some of the other tools around it, are open source. But there is support. There are patches. There's just the general, there's warranties, right? You provide warranty support. The general knowledge that I'm getting genuine Red Hat Linux, right? And I know what I've got. I can trust it. I'm not getting some distribution from like Bob in his mom's basement, which may be better and may have some cool features, but like when Bob gets called up because it's dinner time and I need help, Bob's not there. In addition, what about the idea of like, there's consulting services that sit on top of open source, right? Like you can be the Bobs. You can go in and you might sell integration services. You might have additional add-ons. You might help companies say, yeah, we got this thing, but let me help you work this into like your enterprise architecture and your solutions. But there's lots of things you can sell. What you got to think about is if you're a producer of open source software and you want to commercialize it, don't think of the thing you're selling as being the open source software, because you're not. The thing that is the actual open source software, because he can turn around and sell it the next day, or give it away for free. What you're selling are all the things that you put on top of it, right? You have to plus what you're doing to find a way to provide additional value. As long as you can do that, you can make a mint and still have open source. Questions about any of that? Because that's sort of run through of what we're talking about when we say what it is to be open source versus not. Yeah.
So as a recent example, Redis has sort of shifted some of their licensing from straight MIT to, I guess, something additional where building SaaS services on top of Redis components becomes problematic. Is that still open source? Like, is that discrimination?
So I don't know enough about the specifics to know, although we could talk about it and look at it afterwards. It's not necessarily not open source. It's a question of how they're documenting it maybe and what they're doing. Because remember, like what makes it problematic when you build it, or do you know?
It's something that comes up a couple of weeks ago. I think it was only some specific components on top of core Redis have a limited use in the license, so that if you're, say, Amazon and you're building a managed Redis service, you have to pay Redis Labs.
Mm-hmm.
In the past, it's been go ahead and give them millions of dollars on top of Redis.
You know, That doesn't mean it's not open source, though. It may make people unhappy and still be okay. Companies do lots of things that are okay that make people mad. Having things like dual licensing schemes or requiring people to pay, now, depends also, like, are you paying a fee, are you paying royalties? Because open source is supposed to be royalty free, right? So if it is a royalty, or let's say I can't build this thing on top of Redis and redistribute, because if I redistribute it in this specific way, then I have to pay some sort of royalty or fee back to Redis Labs as a result of my future distribution, kind of like a pyramid scheme type thing, then that would be very problematic from an open source standpoint. If all they're doing is dual licensing or charging certain licensing costs for certain rights, I mean, software is dual licensed all the time, depending on what your needs are. So, but it might depend. It's kind of like one of those maybes.
Dual licensing is sort of a pick whichever one, is it? Or is it, can you stipulate that one license is applicable in some circumstances and others?
You can kind of go either way. You can kind of go either. Usually, though, when you hear about dual licensing, right, it's that sort of, are you building something open source yourself? Are you doing something for the public good, whatever? Are you using it in this way? If so, then you can have this license. If you're doing these other things, then you should buy this commercial license. And so that's sort of like a mishmash of the two things you're saying, right? Because you can kind of choose your own adventure.
Yeah, so the only example I've really seen that's been a common dual MIT Apache
Mm-hmm.
combination, which is PIP2, and I don't know why anyone would not just pick.
Oh, well, we can talk about that. I can tell you why you might not just pick MIT. Right. But we'll get to that in a minute. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you touch a bit about how copyright can be applied, considering that computer programmers don't invent programming languages, we don't invent keywords, but somehow or another, you can copyright a piece of source code, even though there's nothing unique about it? Is there even such a thing? Like companies say put copyright on top of your source code, but is it really a copyright, or is it just something people just do because they've been told to do?
No, it's really a copyright. It's really copyright. It's not about, because it's not I created this keyword or I created this programming language. I mean, this is sound tongue in cheek, but like as a comparison, I write and publish a book. Unless I'm Shakespeare, I probably didn't invent any of the words, or Rowling, right? But like, I didn't invent the words. I didn't invent the language. but the combination and the idea of copyright is actually about works of authorship and about the conveyance of ideas, which is a little separate topic from open source, but from an intellectual property standpoint, the idea behind copyright is you are telling a story in some fashion through any medium. It can be through dance, it can be through painting, it can be through music. You're taking ideas and you are conveying ideas to the recipient of those ideas through some form of expression. And so the copyright on software is not because you came up with like the var keyword. It's because you've taken the language and the tools that have always been there and you're building on top of that and staying on top of that and creating new ways of expressing ideas, new algorithms, new ways of accomplishing goals through the programming languages that already exist. It's about that work of authorship that is the copyright.
So if someone read your code and did the exact same thing, but he wrote your code in a different way, how does your copyright exist?
If he
Like to give an example, I come to NDC and I see an algorithm up there, and 3 of us write it. How are we expressing a new idea? Our code, each of us are copyrightable, but we all saw the same idea.
Right. I mean, I mean, theoretically, seeing someone's idea and then re-expressing it in a different way.
You use integers, I use floats.
Right. Sure. May be distinctly copyrightable. But you got to be careful there because I saw your thing in your talk, and now I took that snippet and I just embedded that in my thing. Now, strictly speaking, you've infringed on my copyright. You got to be careful. Is anyone going to ever know? Is anyone ever going to sue you? I don't know. As a lawyer, I'm not allowed to advise you on the audit risk. Okay? Different ways or different languages are like, oh, I like that idea, but I can express it this way or make it better. That's okay. That's okay. I mean, to get back to your original question, like that's the idea. Is like the copyright is about that new expression of ideas. It's not really about novelty because that's more of a patent issue, right? A new novel thing is more like, can you patent your algorithm? And I have a whole soapbox about software patents that I'm going to try to avoid. It's like I gave my JavaScript talk yesterday. I talked about the soapbox I have about classes in JavaScript. I have soapboxes about a lot of things. I have a very, very hefty one about patented software, but it is a thing. But that's more looking at issues of like novel new inventions as opposed to expressions of ideas or solving a problem through code.
But the patent, you actually apply for it. So you're doing something to disclose.
Yeah, and copyright's automatic upon completion of the work.
Copyright is automatic, so where does the automatic end? How are you getting an automatic just by typing something that may be typed by 300 million people around the world?
I think if you're doing 8,000 lines of code and they're all identical to
Right. That's right. We can talk more about it afterwards. But like, I mean, it's sort of there's a gray area, right? You got to like find and decide what's hard is there's a gray area where at some point you got to draw bright lines. But I mean, we can talk more about it afterwards. We'll chat. Yeah. You don't have to explicitly sign a contract. Yeah, right. Well, you should have. How often do you download software and get a little window that pops up and is like, check the box? I agree with the terms and conditions. That's the biggest lie on the internet. Right? Like there is no bigger lie other than like I agree that I'm 18 years old or older or something, right? But like other than that, there is no bigger lie on the internet that I've read and agreed to the terms and conditions before I actually check the box and sign it. Still did it. And even if you don't check a box, like contract, offer acceptance consideration. Okay? I've offered some software to you. You have accepted that thing because you're taking it and I offered it with a license and you are using it. And the consideration is you're able to use this thing, like things have exchanged. So you've got a contract. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the license is effectively a private agreement between two parties, and if you violate it, then then someone can sue you for breach of the license. Well, right. That's a bigger problem. I don't know how it is here in Australia, but like in the States, right, where we have the most litigious society, like in the history of the earth, we have to worry about these things, right? Because people sue over like anything, like you hurt someone's feelings, and they sue you. So yeah, they're protective. I mean, enforcement's like a whole different thing because again, it's like how easily will someone even find out if you breach, and if they do, how do you do that, and who has the pockets? Like there's a lot that goes into that, but they are enforceable contracts nonetheless. Some of it's theoretical. Where it gets tested is between big companies with lots of deep pockets, lots of money, with lots of lawyers to go after each other. And then one way or another, that law gets determined and seems to kind of dictate what happens among smaller parties. I mean, realistically, right, like, are you going to get sued or is someone going to come after you as an individual? I mean, I don't know how many Learjets you own. If you have a lot of them, then the answer may be yes, right? But if not, the answer is probably no, because it's not worth the time. But there's that whole depends. That's why I say I can't advise on an audit risk. I don't know. But strictly speaking, absolutely enforceable and absolutely litigatable, possible to be litigated. So totally, yeah. All right, move on to the thing. Okay, licenses. So I've mentioned OSI before, open source initiative. This is sort of like a governing body, like a standards body. So when I talk about all these different types of things that make an open source license open source, that's because these guys have said it's okay. When Douglas Crockford says, I want to create a license and I want to call it open source, but I'm not going to let anybody use the thing for evil purposes, these are the guys who say, well, then that's not open source. So all these different licenses that are recognized open source licenses are so because OSI has said this license satisfies that open source definition and is good enough and qualifies and meets the conditions of what we say open source is. And open source licenses kind of follow a spectrum from this like idea of being a permissive license to a copyleft license. People heard the term copyleft before? A few? Couple? We'll talk about it a bit, like GPL is like the classic example, and we'll talk about what that means and why. But copyleft licenses are sort of like ensuring like freedom forever, so to speak. Right, so as opposed to something like copyright where I've retained all my rights, copyleft is I'm putting this out there, but when you redistribute my open source, it's got to be open too. And then after that, it's like open forever and ever, amen. Right? So the copyleft is kind of a mechanism to ensure that open source software, once open source, remains that way indefinitely. And permissive licenses are the other end of the spectrum, which are sort of, you have this thing and you can do whatever you want with it. You want to close it on your redistribution? That's fine. You want to do whatever? We don't care. It doesn't matter. And it's sort of a broad spectrum. What we're going to do is talk about 4 licenses or families of licenses, MIT, BSD, Apache, GPL, that make up like 85 to 90% of all open source projects on GitHub today and everywhere else, and kind of go through them in that order, which kind of follows from most permissive to most copyleft. And we'll kind of see how that works and why it matters, which in the process will also answer the question of, well, why would you choose Apache versus MIT? So we'll talk about that. First off, the MIT license. Who here has used software under MIT? Who here loves the MIT license? It's okay. I'm not going to laugh at you. Okay. You just know you use it, right? Exactly. Right. No. Who has it in their minds that the MIT license is the one, like you see that, it's totally good, you're okay? Yeah. Okay. Right. Because it's extremely permissive. So the MIT license predates the open source definition. It goes back before there was open source. And the MIT license, you don't have to read, don't read this. But like this is it. There's a couple different flavors, but they all basically look like this. And that may look like a lot of words on a slide for a talk, but I will tell you, as a lawyer, as a legal document goes, that's like a nursery rhyme, right? And it's very simple. It's a simple license. It's easy to read. The whole first paragraph is the permissive stuff, just saying a non-exclusive list, right, including without limitation, you can do all of these things with this software, right? You can merge it and copy and distribute, sublicense, sell, whatever you want to do. The other two things, the second little bit, those two lines, is just about attribution. So this is kind of like the it's not public domain thing. Even MIT, the most permissive of licenses, you're still expected to give attribution. If you redistribute the pristine thing itself, you're supposed to include a copy of the license. You're supposed to include a copy of the copyright notice on your distribution. You didn't write it. Yes, you have a license to it. It wasn't an assignment or transfer of copyright ownership to you. It's a license of the thing that I wrote, and I'm licensing you to use my copyrighted work. Please don't pretend that you're me. Please don't pretend like you wrote it. Please don't plagiarize, right? So, you still have to give attribution. That last bit, this thing where they shout at you in all caps, which is the worst practice in the law, because I think it's a game, right? They want you to really notice it, but I think it's harder to read. So on the one hand, they're making it no, we really told you, but I can't read it, it's in all caps, is basically a disclaimer of warranty. It is as is. That entire thing is saying, you're getting this license, or you're getting this software under this license. That doesn't mean it does what you think it does. That doesn't even necessarily mean it does what I think it does. I think it works. If it doesn't, it's open source, fix it. Right? Disclaimers of warranty. It's as is software. That's it. That's all MIT has. Now, contrast that with something like BSD. BSD is also an academic license that also predates, in fact, I think it's slightly older than the MIT license. That's out of the University of California, Berkeley. The Berkeley software distribution, which in the very way back olden days was like a Unix-like system. It was distributed. And BSD is very similar to MIT, except there's multiple different versions of the license. So they have lots of different names. Sometimes you see it like the old BSD, the new BSD, the free BSD. I just say remember one of three ways. It's the 4 clause, the 3 clause, or the 2 clause. Okay? The 2 clause is basically MIT. It has the same type of thing. It has the as-is disclaimer, and it requires attribution, like all open source does. The 4 clause, which you don't see very often anymore. Let me talk about the 3 clause first. I got these in the reverse order. We'll come to the 4 clause one. The 3 clause, which is the most common, has an extra provision about non-endorsement. So I build something. You think, this guy, I'm probably a bad example, somebody who actually is some well-known company, well-known name in software builds something. You're using their open source library. You can't, in your own advertising promotional materials for your derived work that uses my thing, you can't use my name and my brand in such a way to make it appear as though I endorse that your software is awesome because it uses my thing, unless I specifically give you permission to do so, right? For a lot of reasons. One is I didn't endorse it, so hey, don't lie. But also because there's this risk that for me as the producer of the open source thing, maybe my thing's awesome. Maybe you build something with it that is not awesome, but that thing gets used by a lot of people, and it looks like it has my endorsement. Now people wonder, maybe I'm not awesome. It's not right. It's not fair. So that is very commonly found in most BSD distributions. The 4 clause one, which isn't really there, also which you don't see very much anymore, had this advertising provision, which is interesting and at first glance sounds great. It says that also in your advertising materials about the thing that you build, you need to include this statement that says this was built, not endorsed by, but this was built using software, that was produced by Jeff Strauss, by Acme Corp, by Microsoft, whatever. Make sure that you're giving that sort of attribution in your advertising materials to the original author of that thing. That sounds really nice, except when you build really large-scale applications that use 50 different open source libraries, and some of those open source libraries have been around forever and have 30 different contributors and pull requests in them, and now all of a sudden you're taking out a $30,000 full-page ad in MSDN, and the entirety of it is a bunch of like thank you, like an Oscar speech to all the people who helped you become, where you are today. It became onerous. People stopped using it, so you don't see it very often anymore. But you got to look for it. If you see a 4-clause BSD, that could be really problematic. And that's BSD in a nutshell. Yes, sir.
In addition to the non-endorsement?
Yes, which is kind of confusing, isn't it? I've always felt like it's sort of contradictory. But if you actually read the language in the license, there's a different intended purpose. So yes, I agree it is somewhat contradictory. But the idea is giving attribution versus, it could be this includes software written by so-and-so, as opposed to putting a big shiny Microsoft badge on it, right? That makes it look like this is Microsoft endorsed certified software because it uses .NET Core, right? So there's a slight distinction. Yeah.
Does that attribution, is that included in the final product as well? Like if you release an app on the marketplace that uses the library with 4-clause BSD, inside that app, do you need to include the attribution?
Well, inside of the app, you mean like when you're actually using, I've opened my phone and there's a thing, I can click and see it all inside? Probably not. But you probably need to have some sort of link. First of all, if it has open source, you have somewhere there has to be through the site where you download the app and through the app store, that can be difficult. So somewhere in in an about thing in your app, somewhere you probably need to have some link that maybe takes you out to a web page that says, includes these libraries with links to those licenses or links to, say, the repo where you can get the code and that kind of stuff. If you're really going to do it right, you should at least include that. Yeah, Mark.
So say I'm browsing through one of stack over those GitHub repos, like a Redis client or something, and I go, oh, that class extension method looks really useful, and I just lift that one class.
It's kind of just sort of like. You should. You should. Right, right. I mean, you're because again, it's not just redistribution, it's derived works, right? So you've basically created derivative work. You've said, I've got this thing, and this particular chunk of it, I would like to use and repurpose or modify or in some way associate into my code. You've created derived work that in part uses that thing. So you should. Yeah.
Then do I have a copyright over that file of that derived work?
You do. You do have a copyright over that derived work with the understanding that the piece of code that lives inside of it that you took is still owned by that upstream author.
Okay.
Now, if you completely tear it...
Well?
Cool. All right. Oh, yep, one more, and I want to keep us
I think in the licenses it says substantial. What is the
Not only is there not necessarily a legal definition of what substantial means, but even if there were, like what the court in New South Wales versus the court in California versus the court in wherever, London, there's not necessarily a set definition, right? So it's interpretive. Hence, all the maybes and it depends that you get out of, waffling lawyers like me. I mean, I think that to your point earlier, 1,000 lines of code, entire classes, pretty clear. A for loop? I mean, how many different ways can you write a for loop? Right? So it's sort of, I think there are some very clear areas, and then there's sort of what I would say is if you're not sure, assume the license applies and the rules apply. Better to be wrong in that direction than the other way, right? Okay. MIT and BSD. So we talked about these guys. Remember, they're both academic. They both predate the open source initiative and predate the open source definition. But then things started happening, because when this was going on, remember, this is the 70s and earlier. Software was on big, giant computers where no one had them. No one could afford computers except for big, expensive research universities. And you had to sign up and have time to go in and actually get into the lab so you could use the computer for 30 minutes. And it was all about research and academia. And then things started happening in the software world. There's the soapbox. I'm not going to stand on it. But like, we started having patents, and with patents came patent trolls, and all the things that go with that, and lots of litigation, because all of a sudden software became a commercial thing that had huge value and had huge risk for organizations. Here's the thing about Apache. Okay, Apache's had a license for a long time. There was what they called Apache version 1.1, which was a very permissive license that you never see anymore. That was just like an MIT type license. What the Apache Foundation determined is that the shift in the industry was moving towards more patentable stuff, and what you noticed was absent from both those two other licenses, MIT and BSD, is there's no discussion of patent at all. But patent is still a form of intellectual property. I build software that is copyrighted, I distribute to you under a license, I've licensed you my copyright. If it turns out something is patentable in there and it gets patented by someone, I have not licensed you that patent, you can get crushed with it. So Apache came along and released a whole new version, Apache 2, which is the Apache license that we see today. And the Apache license is not like a nursery rhyme document. It's a big giant document with numbered clauses and like an entire definition section and all this stuff. It reads more like a traditional contract, which for like a lay person who doesn't read contracts all the time may seem frustrating, but from an actual protection standpoint means that there's a lot more going on there that helps both the consumer and the producer of the software. Most notably, there is a patent protection clause that actually says, I'm also licensing you anything that's patented. I'm also licensing to you anything that is patentable in this software. And moreover, it has sort of a patent, what's really called a patent non-assert clause, but lawyers are sometimes dramatic. We like to call it a poison pill, effectively, which is to say that I've given you a license over this patent. If at any point in time you decide to turn around and pursue patent litigation or claims back against an upstream author, because that's a lot of how trolling works, right? There's this thing, and then you decide you can patent it, and in the United States anyway, patents like first to the courthouse steps. Doesn't matter that you invented it, I filed for it. I got the patent, and now I'm going to turn around and sue everybody or hold them hostage because I now hold the patent, and you are violating my patent because people are jerks. And so with that, it also says, if you turn around and do that, your license over that patent terminates immediately with no further action required by me.
So how's that different from Facebook's BSD plus?
The Facebook thing is like a whole fiasco. The Facebook BSD plus patents thing is that so I'm a cynic, which is actually a synonym for lawyer. And so I generally believe that they probably didn't have the best of intentions and they were trying to be cute with it. It's like, no, this is just like having Apache, but it wasn't. And the reason why is because this is narrowly scoped. I'm giving you a piece of software under a license. That license includes a patent license, and if you turn around and assert patent litigation or claims back up against other authors and contributors under this thing, then your license to the patents in this thing terminates. I'm protecting that. What Facebook did was say, this is BSD, but also, if you just sue us for anything, including if we infringe on your patents and you sue us for it, we're taking away your license to do this thing. It's pretty evil. Yeah. And despite knowing it was evil, despite everyone saying it was evil, they kept saying, well, no, it's just not that influence the Apache license, and it really wasn't just like the WordPress. Like folks were like, we're stripping all this out. And they're like, okay, all right, just kidding, we'll change it. And they still, I think, last I checked, have only done it for like React. Like I think React Native still has it, and there's other like Facebook libraries that still haven't fixed that problem. So it's like an ongoing issue. It's better on React, like core React. But it's not the same as this. It just masquerades as something similar to this, but with much more evil intent. That's the difference, though. What they're saying is that if you sue them for anything, whether they will or not, I don't know, but what they're saying in the document is if you sue them. Right. it was really brilliant, like, business strategy. With some of the heat that was being applied on Facebook over the last several months, it's like, hey, everyone uses React. Let's do this. And no one can sue us anymore. Yeah. Whether they'll really turn around and try to like shut your site down because you sue for a data breach, or you sue because of, I mean, it's up to them whether to enforce or not. But also, like, as with most things in contract law, again, hashtag not your lawyer and hashtag not an Australian lawyer. But at least in the States, like, non-enforcement in one case does not mean I can no longer enforce later. So I could just choose not to enforce, and later it's like, oh, now I think I will. So, yeah, it's not great. It's not great. All right, GPL. Free as in freedom. Sure. Sort of free as in freedom. Free as in freedom of information. Free as in open source forever. That's great. GPL is the copyleft, which I've kind of said before, is the idea that I have this thing, I open it up, I give it to you under a GPL license, you want to use it, you can. It's still open source. You can still, all the things that make it open source are still true. You can make your own derived work. You can redistribute your derived work. It will be under GPL. Everything you build with this thing that is GPL, no matter how small the GPL thing is, the thing that you derive from it is now also GPL. It will be open source forever. It will not become closed source, won't be proprietary. You can't close it because free is in freedom. Really, really, really cool if you are very passionate about free software and the free and open source community and you want to build a thing and that's what you want. Less cool if you are in an enterprise job building things for your clients and your company and your product and you accidentally open source your entire product. So the scenario really matters here, right? I come off as like being anti-GPL. I'm not. I'm very anti-GPL if someone on my team comes to me and says, hey, we've got to release this thing to the client, deliver tomorrow, and I found this thing, can we use it? No. Go to the next item in your Google search results and see if that one's better, right? Like, it really matters what you're trying to do. Now, so the whole point here is that, like, yes, it is the most open, but most open also means that it is the most restrictive. So GPL is also kind of a funny one because with BSD, for example, MIT, there's a couple different versions. There's like this X11 version, the expat version, but they're all basically the same thing. And the BSD, you don't see the for clause anymore. You rarely see the to clause, and if you do, it's really MIT. Like, so that's all fine. You never see the old Apache. GPL, there are a bunch of different versions, and they're all out there in the wild. And you see them frequently. And which one you have matters. So, for example, we're currently on version 3 of the GPL license, but you will still see version 2 nearly as frequently. GPL version 3 was released to post Apache 2 and was released for a handful of reasons. First of all, it actually added the patent stuff, similar to what Apache has, because GPL 2 didn't have it. It did some things to clarify and improve compatibility with GPL software versus other things. And it actually made clear that, remember all the way back a little while ago, we were talking about like what is distribution and like the global thing and like have you distributed and what if you're just running an API on a server in the cloud and that's executing in your environment? GPL 3 explicitly clarifies, no, that's not distribution. So if you have a service as an API that only is ever going to run in the cloud and no one's going to have it running anywhere else, you aren't redistributing that, so all the GPL restrictions actually don't apply. GPL 3 is explicit about that, which is a good thing. LGPL, which is the lesser GPL, or the library GPL, is sort of like a soft copyleft. It's still a copyleft license, but what it says is if this thing that is under LGPL is only, you create a derived work with it, and all you've done is dynamically link this LGPL binary or library with your derived work, the dynamically linked thing still has to be redistributed and made available under LGPL, and you can't change the licensing scheme. But you don't have to put all this other thing as part of that derived work. So it's like a soft version. If you statically link, or if you're actually inextricably taking that code and mixing it in with your own code, now like there's no fixing it. You're infected with the GPL provisions. But if you only dynamically link, it's OK under LGPL, only under LGPL. And then a GPL. I don't really know what, it's like the Affero GPL. I actually don't know if that's a person's name or if it means something in like Latin. I don't know. But the a GPL actually closes the loophole that GPL3 provided and says, even if you are running it as a service, as an API that's in some data center or cloud provider or something way up there that no one else ever sees, by using it and people accessing it, you are distributing software. So even that API that lives up in the cloud is open source under GPL. And if someone asks, you've got to give them all the source code and all this stuff. So AGPL is very restrictive. Okay? Now, there's even more to GPL, because you not only have to worry about copyleft stuff, you have to worry about compatibility. So compatibility with GPL asks this question. Right? Can code under license whatever be combined and redistributed with code covered by the GPL? What that means is it's not enough to say, I'm building something, it's a derived work from some other GPL source, so now my whole thing is a GPL licensed piece of open source. That's fine. There's even the question of, while I'm building this thing, I also want to use this other piece of software that's open source under a different license. Are those two things even compatible? If not, I can't, my software, by the nature of its very existence, violates the GPL. Because you can't have anything that adds additional restrictions beyond what GPL allows. Examples of that. Take GPL version 2. GPL version 2 has nothing about the patent stuff, right? So Apache does. Now, on the one hand, the Apache license gives you more rights. It gives you a patent license. Good. It also has that non-assert poison pill. Bad. Right? Like, because we're adding a further restriction beyond what GPL allows, they're not compatible. I can't even build software that has components that have both those licenses in it at all. If I have GPL2, I cannot use an Apache license component in the same piece of software, or I have violated GPL v2. Same thing with the old BSD. That's the 4-clause one. Because that whole advertising, the non-endorsement stuff exists in all the versions of GPL, but the advertising provision doesn't. So I can't mix it with any version of GPL. They're not compatible. Full stop. Yeah? The aggregate work, the distribution. So the things that, like the distribution of software. Put them in two, maybe. Put them in two different packages that are really, truly distinct packages that could completely, wholly live on their own? Sure. Two different packages that are really only two different packages because we're playing games, but actually like neither one of them can actually function without the other one? Probably not. Probably not. Right? So it's like the idea of like, what is the real unit of software that is executing together? What is the thing that's being distributed? Now keep in mind that just because things are compatible, it doesn't mean that GPL doesn't apply. So let's say license X is MIT and license Y is Apache and GPL is like GPL v3. Those things are all compatible. That's fine. Now I can build my new software distribution. And they are compatible, but I can't release it under MIT. I can build it. I'm allowed to make it. When I redistribute it, though, it still has to be under GPL because it's the copyleft stuff still applies to it. All compatibility asks is, am I even allowed to build the thing in the first place without violating the GPL rules? Pretty restrictive. So you can see why in the enterprise space it's tough. Other questions about any of that? All right, cool. So where does that leave us? There's a handful of things we need to think about if we are consuming or writing open source software, especially like in the enterprise. So how do we handle contributions? People familiar with the CLA? CAA? Neither, both. People often think they're the same thing. They're not, but they're very similar. This is a contributor license agreement or a contributor assignment agreement. Oftentimes, if you want to, say, submit a pull request back into something and contribute, because let's say in the real world, we may, even if it's a corporate place, sometimes corporations are nice, right? We improve, we fork some library, an open source thing, but we want to contribute what we've done as an organization back into the main repo and push it back up. So we want to make a contribution, or we want to accept contributions. Contributor license agreement is often required on larger corporate shepherded type repositories. So if you ever wanted to say submit a pull request to like .NET Core, you're going to sign one of these that says, not only are we like submitting the pull request, but we are actually anything that I author that I want to submit back up, that contribution I am licensing it back to you for whatever purposes. The difference between the two is license. I think most people understand in general what a license is. The thing about like as real estate, I own a building. You want to come live there as my tenant, so you pay me rent, and I'm your landlord. I am licensing my home to you. I'm going to move to Denmark, and you want to live in my home, I don't want it anymore, and I sell it to you, I've assigned my home to you. Assignment is transfer. So if you're asked to sign a contribution assignment agreement, you aren't just licensing your rights back, you are transferring ownership of your work and your contributions back to, say, the parent repo. Okay? Surprise. What about surprise liability? I get asked this question a lot. Like we use this thing and all of a sudden one day someone comes and sues us because we forgot or we missed something. So the good news here is generally no, like you have to worry about this. Because remember like the big all caps shouting thing? Right, like it's as is software. So that's both a good thing and a bad thing. Right? On the one hand, it's going to be really hard for someone to come back and sue you for some sort of liability issue because they've received this code from you with this big disclaimer of warranty. On the other hand, when you're the consumer of that thing, you've got to keep that in mind. You can't necessarily turn around and sue Microsoft because the .NET framework didn't work the way you expected it to. Okay. We've already talked ad nauseum about the GPL risk. I think it's pretty clear. Like, you got to think about these things, though. And when I say think about it, I mean think about how you're using your software. Is it really going to be an internal tool? Are you ever going to distribute it? How are you going to manage these things? You need to know what your future looks like to the best of your ability, because it may be okay to use GPL if you're really confident, about the use and the limited use that you're going to have for the software you're going to write. What if it has no license? Like, what if you open a repo in GitHub and there is no license.txt file? Yeah, you can't do anything with it, right? It doesn't mean, oh, good, then that's fine. No. If there's no license, there's no license. There's the whole, like, I found it on the internet. That's nice. I read it on someone's blog. That's nice. Just because I put it out there on a blog doesn't mean that I told you you can have it. It legitimately does not mean that. People often ask about Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow is kind of different because by virtue of contributing and putting stuff on Stack Overflow, like those users who are writing and authoring stuff on Stack Overflow have agreed and there's a license associated with actually publishing that content. But if you go to say like Hansel Minutes, I don't know if he has a license in there or not actually. But if there isn't one, doesn't mean you can just take it. It's still owned by the author. There's still copyright. When you're using, yep. Totally separate issue. Totally, maybe true, but totally separate issue. So there may be a work for hire issue. It could be like a contractual work. I mean, that's largely an employment law question, not so much an open source question, right? Like, what are the terms of employment and how does that work? So they may be right because the terms of that employee's employment may be such that we're paying you for your job, but the work you do is work for hire. So the company may in fact be right, but that's not necessarily a license question in the way we're talking about here. Okay, so what about security? This goes back to the whole, am I just getting like Bob's Linux kernel from Mom's basement? In between World of Warcraft sessions? Or am I getting like Red Hat Linux? Who's providing the security? Do I know who stands behind this thing? If I'm going to use open source software, do I really know who stands behind it? If there's a flaw or a hole, do I know what's going to happen? Or worse yet, what if the thing dies? What if Jimmy Bogard decides that he's had enough of AutoMapper already, it's been forever, and he's tired, and he has a real job, and he's sick of dealing with it, and he just says, you know what, I'm not taking it away, but I'm done. Are you prepared to take up the reins? Is your organization prepared to participate? Are you prepared to deal with the fact that at some point someone may just stop supporting it themselves? Have a plan. How are you going to manage that? Because some libraries are supported by major corporations. Now, granted, they still could walk away from it. But many libraries are supported by people like Jimmy, who's amazing, but he's one dude, and he may move on. And across all of this, there's this idea of the long-term strategy. Quick aside, a little quick fable. Not actually a fable, because it's a true story. It happened. A client of mine from several years ago, consulting client, had a startup was building this sort of photo streaming kind of tool. My firm was brought on to build like a WPF client to help with automated streaming, kind of Dropbox style. Like you put photos in a certain folder on your machine and it streams up to some service. Fine, whatever. And at some point he called one day and he said, hey, Shutterfly's buying me. I said, that's great, congratulations. And then Shutterfly's lawyers called us like 3 days later and said, we need to know about like everything you've used in it to make sure that we were happy with this acquisition and make sure that we know what's in there and there's not, say, like GPL or whatever else. Right? He was okay because we kept track of that stuff. So we sold this thing. So you got to plan like, okay, it's an internal tool now. If it's successful and we have a great test run with it internally, are we going to try to sell this tool in the commercial market later? You got to have some idea of that stuff so you can plan and know what's okay, what isn't okay, and what your rule should be around using open source. Now, so all that being said, like none of this. Sometimes I feel like this talk feels like it's a massive like scare tactic, right? Like it's not. I'm not saying to not use open source because, as we said, like on slide number 1, that's flatly impossible. Okay, and it does save time, and it does save money, and we're not reinventing the wheel all the time, and that's a good thing. It just means you need to know the considerations to keep in mind. So how do we do that? There's a couple ways. Now, I don't endorse any one thing. Like people heard of white source or black duck, that's fine. Like there are other software tools like that available, okay, that are very expensive, but also, depending on your needs, may, and full disclosure, I have nothing to do with either of those companies, like, so, may help you because one of the things that those tools do is they audit and they help keep track of like what you've got. Right? So you know what's in your software. But on the other hand, sometimes that's overkill because they're just really expensive and there's more than you need. But like teamwork is your friend, right? Just get your team to work together. What I often do on anything that's not going to be a huge enterprise scale application is like part of my team working agreement is to be, hey, let's talk about these considerations before we kick off. What are our goals? What are we going to do? What do we know? What are our requirements now and in the long term? Based on those things, what's okay? What is our risk tolerance around open source? We know Apache's okay. We decide we know MIT's okay. We know the GPL 3 and 2 are not okay, but LGPL maybe is okay. Like, you work that out, discuss it as a team, and give things like thumbs up, thumbs down. What that does is it allows team members to at least think about it instead of just submitting the biggest lie on the internet and checking the box and saying, great, I agree. At least they say, oh, God, we had a conversation about this. I wonder what license it is. Oh, it's AGPL. Nope, can't use that. Next search result. That little thing can probably save your butt like 90% of the time. Because there is still some risk, right? Once you put the thing out there, like you can't, it's like Pandora's box. You can't just cram it back in. You can always shut down that distribution. You can always redistribute version 2 with different licensing or whatever and fix the problem. But like the thing you've already distributed is out there in the wild, like it's out there. And the people who receive that distribution can do what they're allowed to do with open source software. So you got to be careful. But the good news is, if you put the right tools in the right people's hands, you're going to get buy-in, and you're going to have success. So bottom line of all that is basically have a plan. Have a plan. Care about this stuff. It really does matter. Right? It really can make the difference between success and not. Include your team in the discussions, and in doing so, what you're going to do is you're going to empower everybody to make good decisions, to avoid unnecessary risks, and to maybe down the road kind of like save your whole product. Right? So, questions about anything at all? Yes, sir.
So in the absence of a CLA, and you've got an open source project out there, and you've got, let's say, 20 contributors, who kind of owns the IP?
Hmm.
Is it just based on percentages of effort? Is it a bit of code that wrote?
I mean, strictly speaking, the person who writes the specific piece of code is the copyright holder of that piece of code. It can get muddy when you kind of get things mixed together, like, well, I wrote this thing, and then like you sort of added this line here to fix this bug. Like that kind of gets weird. But in theory, it's like the contribution that that contributor makes, they're the creator of the work. Oftentimes that doesn't matter, right? But it can, yeah. Oh, either one of you.
I was wondering, like, you're saying that if it's runs on the client, that means that you have to officially license it. That means that if you use Sparrow with Inangular, that then means it's running on their machine, right?
Right. Right. That's right. And I mean, if you've distributed code, it's open source. And if it's open source, those rules apply, which means that you have to make the source code available, you have to have the licenses available, all that kind of thing.
So it can be quite a considerable amount of software by the time you've got a database right.
It can. It can. Yeah. That's like a whole philosophical conversation that we should absolutely have, like over lunch. Does being the copyright holder mean anything? Well, that can be a lot of value depending on what the thing is. So, like, reputation alone does matter. If something happens, if somebody actually infringes on your copyright, you're the lone person who has the right to defend it. Right? If I see that someone's infringing on your work, I can't sue on your behalf. I don't have standing. So, because I don't actually have harm, they weren't my rights, they were infringed. So in that sense, depending on the circumstances, yeah, there may be huge value if there's something where somebody's really infringing on your intellectual property in a way that actually causes damage to you. On run-of-the-mill everyday code, is that likely? No. On larger things or things that blow up that you never thought would? Sure, maybe. And it's always important to know and maintain and reserve your rights. I mean, if you've created something, you should assert that and make sure that you protect yourself. I mean, because it could matter one day. Yeah. Anything else? Yep. Oh, last thing. How are we doing? I'm sorry. Am I like way over? I don't know where we are in time. Yep. Come talk to me at lunch. Yeah. Cool. All right. Thank you.